Sophie Parker was just 8 years old when she discovered the truth about her father's secret life. Living in their beautiful lakeside home in Vermont, everything seemed perfect on the surface. But beneath the facade of family dinners and weekend boat trips lay a web of lies so dark that when Sophie finally exposed them in court, even the judge was left speechless. This is the story of how one brave little girl's testimony not only saved her family, but uncovered a decades-old mystery that would change their quiet New England town forever. The morning sun painted golden streaks across Lake Champlain as Sophie sat on the wooden dock, her feet dangling just above the water's gentle ripples. Her mother, Rebecca, stood at the kitchen window of their Victorian-style home, watching her daughter's morning ritual with a smile while preparing breakfast. These peaceful moments were what made their life in Burlington feel like a slice of heaven. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. "Sophie, sweetie, your pancakes are getting cold," Rebecca called out, her voice carrying across the dewy grass. The smell of fresh blueberry pancakes and maple syrup, real Vermont maple syrup as her father always proudly pointed out, drifted through the morning air. At 35, Rebecca Parker had built what many would consider a perfect life. Her career as a marine biologist at the local research center allowed her to combine her passion for science with her love for the lake. More importantly, it gave her flexibility to be there for Sophie, whether for school events or their special mother-daughter adventures exploring the shoreline for interesting specimens. Sophie raced back to the house, her long auburn hair streaming behind her, identical to her mother's. The screen door creaked familiarly as she burst into the kitchen, bringing with her the fresh scent of lake water and morning air. "Mom, I saw the baby loons again. They're getting so big." The kitchen was Sophie's favorite room in the house. Warm yellow walls, white cabinets with glass fronts displaying Rebecca's collection of vintage teacups, and the big bay window that looked out over the lake. Everything about it felt like home, especially on mornings like this when sunlight streamed through the window, creating dancing patterns on the old hardwood floor. "Really? They must be almost ready to fly now," Rebecca responded, placing a plate of heart-shaped pancakes in front of Sophie. It was their special tradition, heart-shaped pancakes on Thursdays, because Thursdays were when Sophie's father, James, had his early morning meetings at the investment firm and couldn't join them for breakfast. James Parker was what many in town considered a pillar of the community. As a senior partner at Burlington's most prestigious financial firm, he managed the investments of nearly every notable family in the area. His charity work and contributions to local development projects had earned him a sterling reputation, and his handsome face often appeared in the local paper's society pages. "Mom, can we go to the nature center after school today?" Sophie asked between bites, maple syrup dripping down her chin. "Ms. Thompson says they just got a new exhibit about lake ecosystems." Rebecca wiped the syrup from her daughter's face with a napkin, just as she had done countless times before. "Of course we can, sweetheart. You know I never pass up a chance to check out new exhibits. Maybe we can help them with some of our own research data." Sophie beamed, her green eyes, so much like her father's, sparkling with excitement. She had inherited both her mother's love for science and her father's sharp mind for details. At 8 years old, she could already name every species of fish in Lake Champlain and kept detailed journals of her observations, just like her mother taught her. The morning routine continued as it always had, Rebecca helping Sophie pack her school bag, making sure she had her homework, her lunch, and most importantly, her research journal. These moments of domestic tranquility were precious to Rebecca, though lately, she couldn't shake a nagging feeling that something was off. It had started with small things, James working later than usual, mysterious phone calls that ended abruptly when she entered the room, and an increasing distance in his eyes when he looked at their daughter. But Rebecca pushed these thoughts aside. After all, they had built a beautiful life here by the lake, and she had learned long ago that sometimes the best way to protect happiness was to not question it too deeply. What Rebecca didn't know as she watched Sophie skip down the front path to catch the school bus was that their perfect life was balanced on a foundation of secrets. Secrets that would soon come crashing down around them. triggered by one seemingly innocent discovery in Sophie's father's study, a discovery that would set in motion events leading to that fateful day in court when her 8-year-old daughter would stand up and change everything with 4 simple words: "Daddy is lying, Your Honor." The first crack in the Parkers' perfect world appeared on an unusually warm October afternoon. Sophie sat in her father's study, a room she rarely entered, working on her science project about lake erosion. The mahogany-paneled walls and leather-bound books usually made the space feel forbidden, but with her father away at another emergency meeting, she had snuck in to use his computer for research. As Sophie reached for a fresh sheet of paper from her father's desk drawer, her hand brushed against something cold and metallic. Curious, she pulled out a small silver key attached to a numbered tag. It looked important, nothing like the normal house keys her parents used. She was about to put it back when she noticed something else: a crumpled receipt that had fallen behind the drawer. The receipt wasn't what caught her attention. It was the name on it: Margaret Wells. Sophie froze, her heart suddenly racing. Margaret Wells was her best friend Emma's mother, who had disappeared 3 months ago. The entire town had been searching for her, and here was a receipt with her name, dated just 2 weeks before she vanished. Before Sophie could process this discovery, she heard the front door open. Her father's voice echoed through the house, accompanied by unfamiliar footsteps. Panic seized her as she quickly shoved everything back in the drawer, but in her haste, the key slipped from her trembling fingers and skittered under the heavy wooden desk. "The arrangements are final," she heard her father say in a tone she had never heard before. Cold, businesslike, nothing like his usual warm voice. "The offshore accounts are set up. Once the insurance claim goes through for the Wells woman, we'll have everything in place." Sophie's blood ran cold. She pressed herself against the wall behind the desk, trying to make herself as small as possible. Another voice, gravelly and unfamiliar, responded, "And you're sure no one can trace it back to us? That nosy wife of yours isn't suspicious?" "Rebecca?" Her father laughed, but it wasn't his normal laugh. This one sent shivers down Sophie's spine. "She's too busy playing scientist with her precious lake studies to notice anything. Besides, after what happened to Margaret, most people are too scared to ask questions." The conversation continued in the hallway, moving toward the kitchen. Sophie remained frozen behind the desk, her science project forgotten, her mind racing to process what she had just heard. Her father knew something about Mrs. Wells's disappearance. He was involved somehow, and now he was talking about her mother in a way that made her stomach twist with fear. When she finally heard the study door open, Sophie held her breath. Through the gap under the desk, she could see her father's expensive leather shoes as he walked to his chair. The second pair of feet belonged to someone wearing scuffed work boots, so different from the polished shoes her father's business associates usually wore. "One more thing," the gravelly voice said. "What about your kid?" "She's always nosing around with that research journal of hers, like mother, like daughter." There was a long pause before her father responded. "Sophie won't be a problem. I've already started moving things into place. Once Rebecca is out of the picture, I'll send the girl to boarding school. She'll be too far away to cause any trouble." The words hit Sophie like a physical blow. Her vision blurred with tears as she struggled to stay silent. This couldn't be her father speaking, not the man who made her heart-shaped pancakes on weekends and taught her to sail on the lake. But the evidence was right there, in his cold voice and calculating words. The men continued talking, but Sophie could barely hear them over the pounding of her heart. She caught phrases like insurance policy and accident by the lake that made her blood run colder with each passing moment. When they finally left the study, Sophie remained hidden, shaking, until the sun had set and the room had grown dark. That evening during dinner, Sophie watched her father with new eyes. He sat at the head of the table, perfectly groomed in his expensive suit, smiling and asking Rebecca about her day, as if he hadn't just been plotting something terrible. Sophie pushed her food around her plate, unable to eat, unable to look at him directly. "Something wrong with the pasta, sweetheart?" Rebecca asked, noticing her daughter's unusual quiet. Sophie shook her head, forcing herself to take a bite. "Just thinking about my science project," she lied, hating how easily the deception came. But now she understood. Sometimes lies were necessary to protect the people you loved. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Later that night, as Sophie lay in bed clutching her research journal, she made a decision. She would need to be brave, braver than she had ever been. She would need to protect her mother, just like her mother had always protected her. But first, she needed proof. Proof that would make people believe an 8-year-old girl over her respected, powerful father. The key she had found would be her starting point. Tomorrow, she would go back for it, and she would start documenting everything, just like her mother had taught her to do with her lake observations. But this time, instead of studying loons and fish, she would be tracking something far more dangerous: her father's secrets. The next few days felt like walking through a nightmare for Sophie. Every creak in the house, every phone call, every casual conversation at the dinner table took on new, sinister meanings. She had started keeping 2 journals now, one for her lake research that she left visible on her desk, and another, hidden inside her old stuffed penguin, where she documented everything strange about her father. The morning after her discovery, Sophie had managed to retrieve the silver key during her father's early meeting. She'd drawn a careful sketch of it in her secret journal, noting the numbers and unusual markings. But more importantly, she'd started noticing things she'd overlooked before. Her mother's morning swims in the lake had always been routine, but now Sophie watched with growing anxiety as Rebecca dove into the deeper waters. "Be careful, Mom," she called out more frequently than usual, her voice carrying across the water with barely concealed fear. "You're extra protective lately," Rebecca noticed one morning, wringing out her hair on the dock. "Is everything okay, sweetie?" Sophie forced a smile, the kind she'd seen her father use countless times now. "Just worried about the underwater currents. I read about them in my research." Another lie, another knot in her stomach. At school, Sophie could barely focus on her classes. Her best friend Emma's empty seat was a constant reminder of what was at stake. During lunch, she sat alone, methodically writing in her secret journal. She'd started creating a timeline, connecting dates and events that had seemed random before. Mrs. Wells had disappeared on September 15th. 2 weeks before that, Sophie's father had missed their annual father-daughter camping trip for the first time ever, claiming an emergency business meeting. The receipt she'd found was dated September 3rd, right in the middle of that weekend. "Sophie, Earth to Sophie." Her science teacher, Ms. Thompson, was standing over her desk after class. "You seemed a million miles away today. That's not like you." Sophie quickly closed her journal. "Sorry, Ms. Thompson, I've been really focused on my research." The teacher's kind face softened with concern. "I know Emma's absence has been hard on you. If you ever need to talk—" "I'm fine," Sophie interrupted, perhaps too quickly. But Ms. Thompson's words had given her an idea. She needed to visit Emma's house. Maybe there were clues there that could help her understand what her father had done. That afternoon, instead of going straight home, Sophie took a detour. The Wells house sat dark and empty at the end of Maple Street. Yellow police tape still crossed over the front door. As she stood on the sidewalk staring at Emma's bedroom window, a neighbor's voice startled her. "Sophie, what are you doing here, dear?" Mrs. Henderson, their elderly neighbor, called from her porch. "I just miss Emma," Sophie replied truthfully. The old woman beckoned her over, and Sophie noticed something she hadn't before. Mrs. Henderson's house had a perfect view of both the Wells driveway and the lake access path behind it. "Such a terrible thing," Mrs. Henderson sighed, offering Sophie a cookie. "I told the police about the car I saw that night, but they said lots of cars use that lake access." Sophie's heart jumped. "What car, Mrs. Henderson?" "A black sedan, very expensive looking. Like your father drives, actually. It was unusual to see one on the access road so late." The old woman shook her head. "But the police said without proof." Sophie's hands trembled as she wrote this new information in her journal later that night. The pieces were starting to fit together, but they formed a picture so terrible she could barely look at it. Her father's black Mercedes had been in the shop the day after Mrs. Wells disappeared. For a deep cleaning, he'd said. At dinner that evening, James Parker was in an unusually good mood. "I have wonderful news," he announced, pouring himself a glass of wine. "The insurance company has finally processed Margaret Wells's case. As her financial advisor, I'll be handling the disbursement of her policies." Rebecca frowned. "Isn't it too soon? They haven't even found—" She trailed off, glancing at Sophie. "These things have to be handled efficiently," James replied smoothly. "By the way, darling, I've booked that lake cruise you wanted for next weekend. Just the two of you." Sophie's fork clattered onto her plate. The memory of her father's words flashed through her mind. "Once Rebecca is out of the picture—" "I don't want to go," Sophie blurted out. Both parents turned to look at her in surprise. "I mean, I have a science project due. Mom needs to help me with it. Here, on land." James's expression darkened for just a moment before his practiced smile returned. "Now, Sophie, your mother has been looking forward to this. Don't be selfish." That night, Sophie made her most important journal entry yet. At the top of the page, she wrote in careful letters, "Evidence to save Mom." Below it, she began listing everything she knew, everything she'd seen and heard. She had to find a way to protect her mother before it was too late. But who would believe an 8-year-old over James Parker, Burlington's most respected businessman? The answer came to her as she stared at the business card pinned to her bulletin board. Emma's aunt, Patricia Wells, was a lawyer who specialized in criminal cases. Sophie had met her at Emma's birthday party last year. Now, with trembling fingers, Sophie reached for her mother's cell phone, which had been left charging in the hallway. She had to make this call tonight while her father was in his study and her mother was taking her evening shower. Someone had to know the truth before the lake cruise. Someone had to help her stop what was coming. Patricia Wells answered on the third ring. "Hello?" Her voice sounded tired, worn down by weeks of searching for her missing sister. Sophie's carefully rehearsed words caught in her throat. After a moment of silence, she managed to whisper, "Ms. Wells? It's Sophie Parker, Emma's friend. I know something about what happened to Mrs. Wells." There was a sharp intake of breath on the other end of the line. "Sophie? Does your father know you're calling me?" "No," Sophie replied, her voice trembling. "But I found something in his study, and I heard him talking about Mrs. Wells and the insurance money, and now he's planning something for my mom too, and I'm scared and—" "Slow down, sweetheart," Patricia interrupted, her lawyer's instincts kicking in. "Are you somewhere safe? Can you talk freely?" Sophie glanced nervously at her bedroom door. "For now. Dad's in his study and Mom's in the shower. But Ms. Wells, there's a lake cruise this weekend and I think—" A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Sophie's heart nearly stopped. "Someone's coming," she whispered urgently. "Please help us." She quickly ended the call and deleted it from her mother's call history, just as her father's footsteps approached her room. James Parker opened the door, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Everything all right, Princess?" "I thought I heard voices." "Just practicing my science presentation," Sophie lied, holding up her lake research journal. Her father's eyes narrowed slightly, scanning the room. "Your mother's phone is missing from the charging station," he said casually. "You haven't seen it, have you?" Sophie's heart hammered against her ribs. "No, Daddy. Maybe she took it to the bathroom." James studied his daughter's face for a long moment before nodding. "Must be. Sleep tight, Princess." He closed the door, but Sophie noticed he didn't walk away immediately. She could see his shadow under the door, waiting, listening. The next morning, Sophie found her mother in the kitchen, frantically searching through her purse. "I can't find my phone anywhere," Rebecca fretted. "And I need it for work today." "Check the bathroom," James suggested smoothly, not looking up from his newspaper. "You always leave it there after your shower." Rebecca brightened. "You're right. I must have—" She trailed off as she hurried upstairs. Sophie watched her father over her cereal bowl. His calm demeanor seemed more menacing now, like the still surface of the lake hiding dangerous currents below. When Rebecca returned empty-handed, James finally looked up. How strange, he mused. Well, we'll get you a new one today. A better model, with better security features. His eyes flickered briefly to Sophie. Can't be too careful these days. At school that day, Sophie noticed a black sedan parked across the street during recess. The same car was there when school ended, but the windows were too tinted to see inside. She wrote down the license plate in her secret journal, her hands shaking. During her last class, she was called to the principal's office. To her surprise, her father was there, wearing his most charming smile. Sorry to interrupt your day, Princess, but you have a dentist appointment, remember? Sophie didn't remember any appointment, but before she could say anything, her father had signed her out. As they walked to his car, she noticed the black sedan was gone. You've seemed distracted lately, Sophie, James said as they drove, not toward the dentist's office, but toward the lake. Your mother and I are worried about you. All this time spent on your science projects, staying up late writing in your journal. Sophie clutched her backpack tighter. I just want to get a good grade. They pulled up to the lakefront where her father's boat was docked. I thought we could spend some quality time together, James said, helping her out of the car. Like we used to before you started keeping secrets. The word secrets hung in the air between them. Sophie felt cold despite the warm afternoon sun. Her father led her onto the boat, his hand firm on her shoulder. You know, Sophie, he began, starting the engine. Loyalty is very important in a family. Your mother and I give you everything. This beautiful home, your education, all those science books you love. All we ask in return is trust and loyalty. As the boat moved further from shore, Sophie realized with growing horror that her father had never taken her out on the lake alone before. It had always been a family activity, with her mother there to double-check the life jackets and pack snacks. I've noticed you've been very interested in the Wells case, James continued, his voice eerily calm over the engine's hum. Even visiting their house yesterday. Sophie's blood ran cold. How did he know? Mrs. Henderson called to tell me, he answered her unspoken question. She was concerned about you, of course, just like I am. He cut the engine, letting the boat drift in the deeper waters. Is there anything you want to tell me, Sophie? Anything at all? The gentle lapping of waves against the boat did nothing to calm Sophie's racing heart. Her father was watching her with an expression she'd never seen before. Calculating. Dangerous. She thought about her secret journal in her backpack, about Patricia Wells probably trying to reach her, about her mother who still had no idea what was coming. No, Daddy, she whispered, forcing herself to meet his eyes. Nothing at all. The smile that spread across James Parker's face was like winter frost creeping across the lake. That's my good girl. Now why don't you tell me all about your science project? After all, we have the whole afternoon ahead of us. Just the two of us. Out here where it's nice and quiet. The boat ride had lasted 3 terrifying hours. When James Parker finally docked as the sun was setting, he helped Sophie off the boat with the same gentle courtesy he'd always shown, as if he hadn't just spent the afternoon delivering veiled threats while drifting in deep water. Remember our talk, Princess, he said softly, his hand squeezing her shoulder just a little too tightly. That night, Sophie couldn't sleep. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the dark water surrounding the boat, heard her father's too calm voice asking about secrets. She hadn't told him about the phone call to Patricia Wells, but somehow she felt he knew. He always seemed to know everything. The next morning, Sophie was surprised to find a visitor in their kitchen, Detective Sarah Chen from the Burlington Police Department. She was sitting at their breakfast table, her badge glinting under the morning light, asking Rebecca questions about Margaret Wells. We're following up on some new information, Detective Chen explained, her dark eyes sharp and observant. Mrs. Parker, you mentioned Margaret was acting strange in the weeks before her disappearance? Rebecca nodded, pouring coffee. Yes, she seemed nervous, distracted. She kept checking her phone during our Lake Conservation Committee meetings. Sophie lingered in the doorway, listening intently. Her father was nowhere to be seen. Another early morning meeting. Detective Chen noticed Sophie and smiled warmly. You must be Sophie. Your mom tells me you're quite the scientist. She tilted her head slightly. You were friends with Emma Wells, weren't you? Something about the detective's gentle tone and direct gaze made Sophie want to tell her everything, but her father's words from yesterday echoed in her mind. Loyalty is very important in a family. Yes, Sophie answered carefully. Emma's my best friend. Is, Rebecca corrected gently. Emma is your best friend, sweetheart. We have to keep hope. Detective Chen's eyes never left Sophie's face. You know, Sophie, sometimes kids notice things adults miss. They see patterns, details, like a good scientist would. Is there anything you've noticed? Anything at all? Sophie clutched her Lake research journal tighter. The front door opened, and James Parker's voice boomed through the house. Meeting finished early. Rebecca, darling, is there coffee? Sophie watched as her father entered the kitchen, his surprise at seeing Detective Chen masterfully concealed behind a pleasant smile. Detective, what brings you to our home this morning? Just following up on the Wells case, Detective Chen replied, her tone professional but her eyes watchful. Mrs. Parker was telling me about the Lake Conservation Committee. Ah yes, tragic business, James said, pouring himself coffee. I'm handling all of Margaret's financial affairs. Such a responsibility, ensuring everything is properly managed. I'm sure it is, Detective Chen murmured. She turned back to Sophie. You were about to tell me something? James's coffee cup clinked against its saucer, just slightly but enough to make Sophie flinch. Actually, she said quietly, I just wanted to show you my lake research. For school. Detective Chen's expression didn't change, but something flickered in her eyes. She pulled out a business card, holding it out to Sophie. I'd love to see your research sometime. Maybe you could bring it to the station. We have a whole scientific analysis unit that would be fascinated by your work. Before Sophie could take the card, James stepped forward smoothly. That's very kind, Detective, but Sophie's schedule is quite full with school and activities. Perhaps another time. Detective Chen stood, tucking the card into her jacket pocket instead. But as she gathered her things, she accidentally dropped some papers. While crouching to pick them up, she whispered to Sophie, who had rushed to help. My personal cell is on the back of that insurance form by your foot, if you ever need to talk about your research or anything else. Sophie slipped the paper into her journal, her heart pounding. As Detective Chen left, she caught one last exchange between the adults. By the way, Mr. Parker, Detective Chen said casually, we're looking into some interesting financial patterns around the time of Margaret's disappearance. Would you be available to discuss those at the station tomorrow? Of course, James replied smoothly. Though you'll want to speak with the firm's legal department first. Standard procedure. The moment Detective Chen's car pulled away, James turned to Sophie. His voice was light, but his eyes were hard. Time for school, princess. I'll drive you today. But the bus, Sophie started. I insist, James cut in. During the drive, he spoke about normal things. School, her science project, the upcoming lake cruise. But Sophie noticed they were taking a strange route, one that passed by the deep quarry outside town. Beautiful view, isn't it? James remarked, slowing the car. But dangerous. People need to be careful around deep water. One wrong step. He let the sentence hang in the air before continuing toward her school. That afternoon, Sophie waited until her father was in a conference call before sneaking into his study. With trembling fingers, she dialed Detective Chen's number from the insurance form. Detective Chen, came the quick response. It's Sophie, she whispered. I need to tell you something about Mrs. Wells and about my mom, but my dad, he took me on the boat yesterday and today by the quarry, and I'm scared. Listen carefully, Sophie. Detective Chen's voice was urgent but calm. Don't do anything to make your father suspicious. I have a team watching your house. We're going to need your help, but I promise we'll keep you and your mom safe. Can you be brave for a little longer? Sophie thought about her mother, about Emma waiting for answers, about Mrs. Wells. Yes, she said firmly. I can show you my real research journal, the one with all the evidence. But we have to hurry. The lake cruise is this weekend, and I think my dad is planning something terrible." That night, thunder rolled across Lake Champlain as Sophie lay in bed, pretending to sleep while listening to her parents' voices drift up from below. The storm had forced them inside instead of their usual evening walk, and now their conversation, mixed with rain beating against the windows, carried clearly through the old house's heating vents. "James, Detective Chen asked about the insurance policies today," her mother was saying. "Why didn't you tell me you were handling Margaret's accounts?" "It never came up," James replied smoothly. "Besides, you've been so busy with your research. Speaking of which, how's the preparation for the lake cruise going?" Sophie slipped out of bed and crept to the heating vent, pressing her ear closer. Something in her father's tone had changed, that same dangerous undercurrent she'd heard on the boat. "Actually," Rebecca said, "I was thinking of postponing it. Some of the water samples from the deeper areas have shown unusual chemical compositions. I'd like to investigate further before—" "Absolutely not." James's voice was sharp now. "Everything's arranged. The boat's been specially prepared. It has to be this weekend." The silence that followed made Sophie's skin crawl. When her mother spoke again, her voice was different, cautious, probing. "Has to be? James, what's really going on? First Margaret disappears, then these insurance policies, and now you're insisting on this cruise. You're being paranoid, Rebecca." James's laugh held no warmth. "This is exactly why you need a break. You're starting to sound like Margaret before she—" He stopped abruptly. "Before she what, James?" Sophie heard movement. Footsteps, the clink of ice in a glass. Her father's voice became muffled, as if he'd moved to another room. Sophie tiptoed to the upstairs study vent instead, catching his words mid-sentence. "Getting too close, just like Margaret did. The lake preservation project, if they test those deeper waters." He was on the phone now, speaking in hushed tones. "No, I've handled it. The cruise is the perfect opportunity. The storm will make the waters choppy. Accidents happen all the time in bad weather." Sophie's blood ran cold. She needed to document this. Grabbing her secret journal, she began writing frantically, recording every word she could hear. But as she wrote, her hands trembling, something caught her eye through the study window, a flash of movement in the rain. Squinting through the storm, she could make out a figure moving near her father's car. Even through the darkness and rain, she recognized Detective Chen's silhouette. The detective was placing something under the vehicle, probably a tracking device. Suddenly, the study door handle began to turn. Sophie dove behind the heavy curtains just as her father entered. Through a small gap, she watched him move to his desk and open a hidden panel she'd never noticed before. From it, he removed a small vial and what looked like mechanical parts. "Yes, everything's ready," he spoke into his phone. "Once Rebecca's gone, Sophie will be easier to handle. Boarding school in Switzerland is already arranged. By the time anyone starts asking questions, the money will be moved offshore." He paused, listening. "No, the police won't find anything. The chemicals break down in water within hours. That's why it had to be the lake for Margaret. Perfect for dissolving evidence." Sophie pressed her hand to her mouth to stifle a gasp. In her other hand, she clutched her journal so tightly the pages crinkled. Her father was talking about murder, Mrs. Wells's murder, and now her mother's planned accident. A floorboard creaked under her foot, and James whirled around. "Someone there?" he called out sharply. Sophie held her breath, pressing herself further into the curtains. After what felt like an eternity, she heard him return to his desk. "Must be the storm," he muttered. But now he was pulling out more papers, spreading them across his desk. Even from her hiding spot, Sophie could see they were insurance documents. Lots of them. Her mother's name was at the top of one, with numbers so large they made Sophie's head spin. "Everything's in place," James continued on the phone. "The boat's brake line has been modified. Once they hit the deeper water, where we took care of Margaret, the storm will provide perfect cover. The chemicals are untraceable, just like last time." Sophie's hand shook as she tried to write everything down. She had to get this information to Detective Chen. But as she shifted slightly to see better, her journal slipped from her fingers. The soft thud of the notebook hitting the carpet seemed to echo in the quiet room. James stopped mid-sentence. "I'll call you back," he said tersely. Sophie watched in horror as her father's expensive shoes moved toward her hiding spot. The curtain began to move. In desperation, she did the only thing she could think of. She burst from behind the curtain, snatched her fallen journal, and ran. "Sophie!" Her father's voice boomed behind her, but she didn't stop. She raced down the hallway, taking the stairs 2 at a time. "Rebecca!" James called out, his voice instantly transforming into one of paternal concern. "Sophie's having one of her nightmares again. She's sleepwalking." Smart, Sophie thought as she ran. If her mother came out now, she'd think Sophie was just having a bad dream. No one would believe what she'd really seen and heard, but Sophie had evidence now, real evidence in her journal. She just had to get it to Detective Chen before the lake cruise, before her father could hurt anyone else. She made it to her room just as her mother emerged from the master bedroom. Diving under her covers, Sophie forced her breathing to slow, clutching her journal under her pillow. She heard her parents' voices outside her door. "Poor thing," Rebecca said softly. "She's been so unsettled lately." "Yes," James agreed, his voice gentle but with an edge Sophie now recognized. "Perhaps she needs more than just a normal doctor. We should discuss options after our cruise." Morning arrived with sheets of rain still battering against the windows. Sophie hadn't slept at all, her mind racing with everything she'd discovered. The lake cruise was tomorrow, and she knew she had to act fast. Her father had already left for work, which gave her a narrow window of opportunity. Dressed for school but with no intention of going, Sophie waited until her mother was in the shower before sneaking into the master bedroom. Her hands trembling, she found her mother's spare phone, the old one Rebecca kept as a backup in her dresser drawer. It wasn't activated, but it could still call 911. And, Sophie hoped, Detective Chen's number. The detective answered on the first ring. "Chen here." "He's going to kill her," Sophie whispered urgently. "Tomorrow on the cruise. I heard everything last night. He killed Mrs. Wells too, used chemicals that dissolve in the water. He has them hidden in his study, and documents about insurance money and—" "Slow down, Sophie," Detective Chen interrupted. "Are you safe right now?" "Yes, but—" "Stay where you are. I'm sending a car to pick you up. Officer Martinez will bring you to the station. We need your journal and everything you've documented." Sophie clutched the phone tighter. "But my mom—" "We'll protect her," Detective Chen assured her. "But we need evidence to move. Your father is very powerful, Sophie. We have to do this right." The sound of the shower stopping made Sophie's heart race. "Someone's coming. Hurry." She barely had time to hide the phone before Rebecca entered the bedroom, wrapped in a towel. "Sophie, why aren't you at the bus stop?" I don't feel well," Sophie managed, which wasn't entirely a lie. Her stomach was churning with anxiety. Rebecca's face filled with concern as she pressed a hand to Sophie's forehead. "You do feel warm, and you've been so pale lately. Maybe we should postpone the cruise." "No," Sophie said quickly, remembering her father's insistence about the timing. "I mean, you deserve a break, Mom. I'll be fine. I just need to rest today." Rebecca studied her daughter's face. "You've been different lately, sweetheart. Scared. Is something bothering you? You know you can tell me anything." Sophie opened her mouth, wanting desperately to warn her mother. But at that moment, she heard the front door open. "Hello?" James's voice called up the stairs. "I forgot some papers in my study." Sophie's blood ran cold. He was supposed to be at work. Had he somehow known about her call? She clutched her backpack, containing her precious journal, tighter. "We're upstairs," Rebecca called back. "Sophie's not feeling well." Heavy footsteps on the stairs. Then James appeared in the doorway, his expression concerned but his eyes sharp. "Not feeling well, Princess? What's wrong?" "Stomach ache," Sophie mumbled, avoiding his gaze. James moved closer, resting a hand on her shoulder. His grip was gentle but firm. "You know, I heard a strange thing this morning. Detective Chen was asking questions at my office about insurance policies about the lake. His hand tightened slightly. About phone calls. Sophie's heart nearly stopped. Behind her father, Rebecca was getting dressed, oblivious to the tension in the room. Maybe she should see a doctor, James continued, his voice perfectly pleasant. I can take her right now before my next meeting. No! The word burst from Sophie with such force that both parents stared at her. I just want to rest. Here. With Mom. A car horn sounded outside, 2 short beeps. Sophie recognized Officer Martinez's cruiser through the window. Her escape route had arrived, but her father was blocking the doorway. James moved to the window, his expression darkening as he spotted the police car. Rebecca, darling, why don't you finish getting ready for work? I'll take care of Sophie. But Rebecca was frowning now, looking between her daughter's frightened face and her husband's rigid stance. James, what's going on? Why is there a police car outside? Yes, James, Sophie found herself saying, her voice stronger than she felt. Why don't you tell Mom about the police? About Mrs. Wells? About the chemicals in your study? The silence that followed was deafening. Rebecca's eyes widened. What chemicals? James, what is she talking about? James's mask of concern cracked for just a moment, revealing something dark and dangerous beneath. But before he could speak, footsteps thundered up the stairs. Police! Mr. Parker, step away from the child. Detective Chen appeared in the doorway, gun drawn, with Officer Martinez right behind her. Sophie had never felt so relieved in her life. What is the meaning of this? James demanded. But Sophie noticed his hand moving toward his jacket pocket. Don't! She screamed, remembering the vial from his study. He has chemicals, Detective. In his pocket. Everything happened at once. James lunged toward Sophie. Rebecca screamed, and Detective Chen tackled James to the ground. A small glass vial flew from his pocket, shattering against the wall. The acrid smell that filled the room made everyone's eyes water. James Parker, you're under arrest, Detective Chen announced, handcuffing him as Officer Martinez moved Sophie and Rebecca to safety. We found Margaret Wells's body this morning. The Lake Preservation Project's water testing revealed traces of the chemicals, and now we have this sample to match it. As they led her father away, Sophie heard him say one last thing to her mother. I did it for us, Rebecca. For our future. Everything was going to be perfect. Rebecca pulled Sophie close, both of them shaking. Your journal, Sophie whispered. All the evidence is in my journal. The storm outside was finally beginning to clear, and through the window, Sophie could see patches of blue sky emerging. Just like the truth, she thought, finally breaking through the dark clouds of lies. The Burlington police station's interview room felt impossibly small as Sophie sat beside Detective Chen, her precious journal open on the metal table. Rebecca paced behind them, still struggling to process everything that had happened that morning. Through the window, Sophie could see other officers cataloging evidence from their house, including the broken vial and her father's hidden documents. Your journal entries are incredibly detailed, Sophie, Detective Chen said, carefully turning a page filled with Sophie's careful observations. The dates, times, conversations, all of it matches our investigation timeline perfectly. But before Sophie could respond, a commotion erupted in the hallway. The interview room door burst open, revealing a tall man in an expensive suit, followed by 2 others carrying briefcases. I'm Gerald Maxwell, James Parker's attorney, the man announced. This interview is over. You're questioning a minor without proper representation or parental consent. Detective Chen stood, her posture rigid. Mr. Maxwell, Mrs. Parker has given consent, and Mrs. Parker is clearly in an emotional state, Maxwell interrupted smoothly. And given the circumstances, we have serious concerns about the child's stability. In fact, he pulled out a document with a flourish. We have here a psychiatric evaluation from last month indicating Sophie's tendency toward elaborate fantasies. Sophie's stomach dropped. That's not true. Dad never took me to a psychiatrist. Maxwell's smile was cold. The records show otherwise, dear. Your father, concerned about your increasing paranoia and tale-telling, had you privately evaluated. The doctor noted your disposition toward creating complex fictional narratives. Rebecca stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. This is ridiculous. Sophie has never— Mrs. Parker, Maxwell cut in. Your husband had the evaluation done quietly to protect Sophie's privacy. But given these wild accusations, we're forced to bring it to light. The child needs help, not police interrogation. Sophie watched in horror as more people entered the room. A woman in a business suit who introduced herself as a child psychologist, and another who claimed to be from Child Protective Services. This is clearly a case of a troubled child acting out, the psychologist said, reviewing the suspicious evaluation. The recent disappearance of her friend, Emma Wells, appears to have triggered a complex fantasy involving her father. No! Sophie clutched her journal tighter. Everything in here is true. The phone calls I overheard, the key I found, Mrs. Henderson seeing Dad's car. You see, Maxwell interjected. Elaborate conspiracies. James Parker is a respected member of this community. The idea that he would be involved in Margaret Wells's death is absurd. Detective Chen's voice cut through the chaos. We found Mrs. Wells's body exactly where Sophie's journal indicated. The chemical analysis could have come from anywhere, Maxwell dismissed. Lake Champlain is unfortunately polluted with all manner of industrial waste. You have no direct evidence linking my client to anything. The Child Protective Services worker stepped forward. Given the child's mental state and the trauma of these false allegations, we recommend immediate psychiatric intervention. We have a facility ready. You're not taking my daughter anywhere. Rebecca's voice was steel, but Maxwell was already producing more documents. Mrs. Parker, given your emotional involvement and potential instability, we've petitioned for temporary custody to be granted to the state, ensuring Sophie receives the care she needs. Sophie felt the walls closing in. They were trying to discredit her, to make everyone think she was crazy. Just like her father had threatened, sending her away where she couldn't tell anyone the truth. Then she remembered something vital. The silver key, she blurted out. The one from Dad's drawer with the numbered tag. Detective Chen, did you find it when you searched the house? Maxwell tried to interrupt, but Detective Chen held up a hand. Yes, we did. But we haven't identified what it opens. Sophie's heart raced. It's for a safety deposit box. I saw the bank logo on the tag. Burlington Trust, box number 847. Dad put something in there the day before Mrs. Wells disappeared. He didn't know I saw him. The room fell silent. Maxwell's confident smile faltered slightly. That's enough, he said sharply. This interview is over. We're leaving and we're taking the child. Nobody's going anywhere, a new voice announced. Patricia Wells stood in the doorway, her lawyer's badge displayed prominently. Except to Burlington Trust, where a judge has just approved a warrant to open safety deposit box 847. Sophie watched Maxwell's face turn ashen. You can't. We can and we will, Patricia stated firmly. And Mr. Maxwell, the psychiatric evaluation you're holding? The doctor whose signature appears on it was out of the country on the date it was supposedly conducted. I just got off the phone with her. The room erupted in activity. Detective Chen was immediately on her radio, coordinating with officers to secure the bank. The Child Protective Services worker and psychologist quietly slipped away, while Maxwell sputtered threats about lawsuits and procedures. Rebecca wrapped her arms around Sophie, holding her tight. I'm so proud of you, she whispered. So proud of how brave you've been. But Sophie knew it wasn't over. As they prepared to leave for the bank, she caught Maxwell on his phone in the hallway, speaking urgently. He needs to know. They're heading to the safety deposit box. Yes, everything. Tell him to activate the contingency plan. Now. Sophie tugged on Detective Chen's sleeve. He's warning my dad, she whispered. And Dad always has a backup plan. The detective nodded grimly. Then we better move fast. Whatever's in that safety deposit box, your father doesn't want us to find it. And he's already shown how far he'll go to keep his secrets. The drive to Burlington Trust felt like the longest journey of Sophie's life. Police cruisers flanked Detective Chen's unmarked car, their silent presence both reassuring and nerve-wracking. Rebecca held Sophie's hand in the back seat while Patricia Wells reviewed documents on her tablet, occasionally making urgent phone calls. "The bank manager's waiting for us," Detective Chen announced as they pulled up to the imposing stone building. "But there's something else you should know." She hesitated, glancing at Sophie in the rearview mirror. "Your father's been released on bail." Rebecca's grip on Sophie's hand tightened. "How is that possible?" "Money talks," Patricia said grimly, "and James Parker has plenty of influential friends. But don't worry, he's under surveillance and can't leave the state." As they approached the bank's entrance, Sophie noticed something odd. Where are all the customers? The normally busy lobby was eerily empty. "Security protocol," Detective Chen explained. "We've temporarily closed the bank to the public." The bank manager, Mr. Harrison, met them at the door. He was a thin, nervous-looking man who kept dabbing his forehead with a handkerchief. "This is highly irregular," he stammered. "Mr. Parker is one of our most valued clients." "Mr. Parker is also under investigation for murder," Patricia reminded him sharply. "The warrant, please." They followed Mr. Harrison through marble corridors to the safety deposit box vault. Sophie felt a chill as they entered the cold room lined with metal drawers. This was it. The proof they needed would be in box 847. Except when Mr. Harrison opened the drawer, his hands shaking, box 847 wasn't there. "This is impossible," he sputtered, checking the number again. "It was here this morning during our daily inventory." Detective Chen immediately got on her radio. "I need security footage from the vault, last 24 hours. "That's also impossible," Mr. Harrison said, his face growing paler. "The security system went down for maintenance this morning. Standard procedure. Though now that I think about it, the maintenance wasn't scheduled until next week." "He knew we were coming," Sophie whispered. When his lawyer called him, a commotion from the lobby interrupted them. Officer Martinez burst into the vault. "Detective, we've got a situation. James Parker was just spotted entering the Lake Research Center where Mrs. Parker works." Rebecca gasped. "My lab! All my research on the lake's chemical composition is there. Everything I've documented about unusual substances in the water." "That's what he's after," Sophie realized. "He needs to destroy the evidence before the lab processes it." She turned to Detective Chen. "The chemicals they found where Mrs. Wells, where they found her. Mom's research would prove they're not normal lake pollution." They rushed back to the cars, but Sophie noticed Mr. Harrison making a phone call as they left. She tugged on Detective Chen's sleeve. "He's going to warn my dad. He's scared of him, like Mrs. Henderson was." The detective nodded grimly. "Your father's influence runs deep in this town. That's why we need concrete evidence." As they sped toward the research center, Sophie opened her journal to a page she hadn't shown anyone yet. "Detective, there's something else. Something I saw the night I heard Dad talking about the cruise." She pointed to a detailed sketch she'd made of the mechanical parts she'd seen her father remove from the hidden panel in his study. "He said the boat's brake line was modified. I drew everything I saw. I'm good at drawing. Mom taught me how to make detailed scientific illustrations." Detective Chen studied the sketch, her eyes widening. "This is exactly what we need. Sophie, would you be willing to testify about everything you've seen and heard? It won't be easy. Your father's lawyers will try to discredit you again." Sophie looked at her mother, then at Patricia Wells, who had fought so hard to find her sister. She thought about Emma, somewhere out there missing her mom. Finally, she thought about all the times her father had tried to silence her, to make everyone think she was just a confused little girl with an active imagination. "I'll testify," she said firmly. "I'm not making this up and I'm not crazy. Dad needs to be stopped before he hurts anyone else." Rebecca hugged her daughter close. "We'll face this together, sweetheart." The research center came into view. A modern building perched on the lakeshore. Police cars were already surrounding it, lights flashing. As they pulled up, Sophie spotted a familiar black Mercedes parked haphazardly near the entrance. "He's destroying everything," Rebecca said frantically. "Years of research." But Sophie remembered something else, something that made her smile despite the tension. "No, he isn't." "Mom," Remember when you taught me about data backup? How scientists always need multiple copies? Rebecca's eyes lit up. The cloud server. I've been automatically uploading all my results. James doesn't know about it. We still need to stop him, Detective Chen said, checking her weapon. He's desperate now, and desperate people are dangerous. Sophie clutched her journal tighter. Everything she'd documented, every piece of evidence she'd collected, was leading to this moment. Her father had underestimated her, dismissed her as just a child with an overactive imagination. But he'd forgotten something important. She was also a scientist's daughter, trained to observe, document, and stand up for the truth. Be careful, she told Detective Chen. Dad has backup plans for his backup plans. He won't give up easily. As if confirming her words, they heard glass shatter from inside the building. Detective Chen gave rapid orders to her team through the radio. Remember, she said to Sophie and Rebecca, stay in the car, no matter what you hear or see. Sophie watched the police team move toward the building, their weapons drawn. She knew that whatever happened next would change everything. But for the first time since this all began, she wasn't afraid. She had the truth on her side, documented in her careful notes and drawings. And the truth her mother had always taught her was the strongest force in the universe. The Burlington County Courthouse loomed ahead, its granite steps packed with reporters and spectators. 2 weeks had passed since the confrontation at the research center, where James Parker had been arrested trying to destroy Rebecca's lab data. Now, on a crisp autumn morning, Sophie sat in the back of Detective Chen's car, studying her reflection in the window. Are you ready? Detective Chen asked gently, turning to face her. Sophie smoothed down her navy blue dress, the one her mother had bought specially for today. What if the judge doesn't believe me? What if Dad's lawyers make everyone think I'm lying again? Remember, Patricia Wells said from the front seat. Just tell the truth. Your journal entries, the lab results, the evidence from the research center, it all supports your testimony. The courtroom was packed when they entered. Sophie felt the weight of countless eyes on her as she walked down the aisle. Her father sat at the defense table, impeccably dressed as always, flanked by Gerald Maxwell and 2 other lawyers. He smiled at her, that same warm smile that had once meant safety, but now sent chills down her spine. Judge Eleanor Martinez surveyed the courtroom with sharp eyes. She was known for her no-nonsense approach, especially in cases involving children. Given the sensitive nature of this case, she announced, I'll remind everyone that any attempts to intimidate or discredit our young witness will not be tolerated. When Sophie was called to testify, her shoes seemed to echo impossibly loud on the wooden floor as she approached the witness stand. After she was sworn in, the prosecutor, Ms. Thompson, approached with a gentle smile. Sophie, can you tell us about the night you first discovered something was wrong? Sophie took a deep breath, clutching her journal in her lap. It started when I found a key in my father's study, a key to a safety deposit box where he kept documents about Mrs. Wells's insurance policy. The same night, I heard him talking about what he'd done to her. Objection. Maxwell stood. Hearsay from an emotionally troubled child. Your Honor, Ms. Thompson countered. We have surveillance footage showing Mr. Parker accessing that safety deposit box the day before Margaret Wells disappeared, and bank records confirming the insurance policy changes. Overruled, Judge Martinez said firmly. Continue, Sophie. Sophie described everything. The overheard conversations, the chemical vial, the boat modifications. With each detail, she could see her father's confident smile faltering slightly. Then came the hardest part. He was planning to do the same thing to my mom, Sophie said, her voice growing stronger. He modified the boat for their cruise just like he did with Mrs. Wells. I drew pictures of the parts I saw. She opened her journal to the detailed sketches. An engineering expert has confirmed these modifications would cause catastrophic brake failure in deep water, Ms. Thompson added, displaying Sophie's drawings on a large screen. Maxwell stood again. Your Honor, these are clearly the fantasies of a child seeking attention. Mr. Parker had his daughter evaluated. The evaluation was fake, Sophie burst out. You forged it to make me look crazy. just like Dad forged documents about the insurance policies. A murmur ran through the courtroom. James Parker leaned forward, whispering urgently to Maxwell. "Sophie," Maxwell said, his voice silky smooth as he approached the stand. "Isn't it true that you've been upset since your friend Emma's mother disappeared? That you blamed your father because he handles the family's finances?" "No," Sophie replied firmly. "I blamed him because I heard him planning it, because I found evidence, because he was going to do the same thing to my mom." "These are serious accusations from someone so young," Maxwell pressed. "How can we be sure you're not confused, that you haven't mixed up reality with imagination?" Sophie opened her journal to another page. "Because I write everything down. Every date, every conversation, every detail. Mom taught me how to keep accurate scientific records. And science doesn't lie." She turned to the judge. "Your Honor, my dad thought nobody would believe me because I'm just a kid. He thought he could say I was making things up or that I was confused. But I know what I heard. I know what I saw. And I have proof." Suddenly, James Parker stood up. "Enough. This is ridiculous. Everything I did for us. For our future. Sophie, Princess, you don't understand the pressures, the responsibilities." "Mr. Parker," Judge Martinez warned, but he continued. "The insurance policies, the business deals, it was all for our family. Margaret was going to expose everything. She found the offshore accounts, the fake investments. She had to be stopped. And Rebecca's research." He turned to Sophie's mother in the gallery. "Your water testing would have found traces of the chemicals. You were getting too close." The courtroom erupted in chaos. James seemed to realize what he'd done, his face draining of color as court officers moved toward him. Maxwell looked stricken, his carefully constructed defense crumbling. "Daddy," Sophie said quietly, but in the sudden silence her voice carried clearly. "You were wrong. About everything. But especially about me. You thought because I was 8 I couldn't understand. But I understood perfectly. You killed Mrs. Wells. You were going to kill Mom. And you thought you could make everyone think I was crazy when I tried to tell the truth." She held up her journal. "But I'm a scientist, just like Mom. I observe, I document, I find evidence. And now everyone knows the truth." Judge Martinez's gavel cracked through the air. "Order. Mr. Parker, you've just confessed to first-degree murder in open court. Officers, take him into custody. Ms. Thompson, I believe you'll want to amend the charges." As they led her father away, Sophie saw something she'd never seen before. Defeat in his eyes. His perfect plan, his careful manipulations, his powerful connections. All of them had been undone by the detailed observations of the young daughter he'd underestimated. Detective Chen squeezed Sophie's shoulder as she stepped down from the witness stand. "You did it," she whispered. "You protected your mom, and you got justice for Mrs. Wells." Sophie looked at Emma's Aunt Patricia, who had tears in her eyes, then at her mother, who was beaming with pride. "I just told the truth," she said, "and I had evidence to prove it." The hours following James Parker's confession passed in a blur of activity. The courthouse steps were crowded with reporters shouting questions as Detective Chen escorted Sophie and Rebecca to her car. Through the tinted windows, Sophie could see camera flashes and news vans, all eager to tell the story of how an 8-year-old girl had exposed one of Vermont's most prominent businessmen as a murderer. "We'll take you somewhere quiet," Detective Chen said, navigating through the media crowd. "The department has a safe house ready." But Sophie had other ideas. "Can we go to the lake?" she asked quietly. "To our special spot?" Rebecca understood immediately. Their observation point, a secluded cove where they'd spent countless hours studying the lake's ecosystem, had always been their sanctuary. Detective Chen nodded, changing course. As they drove, Sophie watched her mother reading through the journal entries that had helped convict James. Rebecca's hands trembled as she turned the pages, taking in all the signs she'd missed, all the danger she'd never suspected. "I should have known," Rebecca whispered. "All those late meetings, the sudden interest in my research, The irregular bank statements. He fooled everyone, Mrs. Parker, Detective Chen reminded her. Even his closest business associates had no idea about the fraud scheme we uncovered. Your daughter was the only one who saw through it. They parked near the cove where autumn leaves created a carpet of red and gold leading down to the water. 2 police cars discreetly positioned themselves nearby. James might be in custody, but his network of influential friends made protection necessary. Sophie walked to the water's edge, where her mother's research equipment still stood. Sample collection tubes, testing strips, a small weather station. All the tools that had unknowingly been gathering evidence of James's crimes even as he plotted to silence them. The university called, Rebecca said, joining her daughter by the water. They want to fast-track the publication of my research on chemical contamination in deep water environments. It could help develop new detection methods for cases like this. Sophie picked up a smooth stone and skipped it across the calm surface, watching the ripples spread. Do you think Emma will come home now, since we found out what happened to her mom? Patricia Wells, who had followed them to the cove, stepped forward. Emma's flying back tomorrow. She's been staying with her father in Seattle. She knelt beside Sophie. You've given her something precious, the truth about what happened to her mother. That means more than you can imagine. A local news helicopter buzzed overhead, making them all look up. The story was exploding across national media. Child scientist exposes murder plot. 8-year-old's journal brings down financial fraudster. Lake Champlain killer caught by daughter's detective work. We should prepare you for what's coming, Patricia said gently. There will be lots of people wanting to hear your story. Journalists, investigators, maybe even people making documentaries. Sophie shook her head. I don't want to be famous. I just wanted to protect Mom and help find Mrs. Wells. And you did both, Detective Chen assured her. But your story could help other people too. Show them that the truth matters, that evidence matters, that being young doesn't mean you can't stand up for what's right. Rebecca hugged her daughter close. Whatever you want to do, sweetie, I'll support you. We could move away, start fresh somewhere else. No, Sophie said firmly, surprising herself. This is our home, our lake. Dad took enough from us. He doesn't get to take this too. A text alert chimed on Detective Chen's phone. She read it quickly, her expression serious. They've started searching James's office downtown, found documents about other potential victims, wealthy clients whose accidents he was planning. This goes deeper than we thought. He was going to keep doing it, Sophie realized. Keep hurting people for money. Keep pretending to be the perfect businessman who helped manage their finances. Patricia nodded grimly. The DA is already talking about multiple charges: securities fraud, conspiracy, attempted murder. Your father won't see freedom for a very long time. The sun was setting over the lake now, painting the water in shades of orange and pink. Sophie opened her journal to a fresh page and began to write. Not evidence this time, but her feelings, her fears, her hopes for the future. What are you writing? Rebecca asked softly. Everything, Sophie replied. Ms. Thompson says I'll need to testify at the full trial. I want to remember exactly how this feels, so I can tell the whole truth. A fish jumped nearby, creating ripples that intersected with the fading waves from Sophie's skipped stone. She thought about how her father had used the lake's depths to hide his crimes, never expecting that the same waters would help reveal them through her mother's research. Detective Chen? Sophie asked suddenly. What happens now? To all of Dad's money and the company and everything? That's complicated, the detective admitted. There will be investigations, asset seizures, lawsuits from his clients, but your mother's lawyer is already working to protect your legitimate assets. Rebecca squeezed Sophie's hand. We don't need his money. We have something more valuable, each other, and the truth. As darkness fell, they could see lights coming on in houses along the shore. In one of them, Sophie knew, Mrs. Henderson was probably watching the news, finally understanding what she'd witnessed the night Margaret Wells disappeared. In another, the bank manager, Mr. Harrison, was likely dealing with federal investigators about his role in the safety deposit box incident. The weight of it all, The testimonies still to come, the media attention, the long legal battles ahead, felt overwhelming. But here by the lake, with her mother's arm around her and her journal in her hands, Sophie felt stronger than ever. She had faced her father's lies with scientific truth, his manipulations with careful documentation, his underestimation of her with unwavering courage. "Mom?" she said quietly. "Can we still do our research here?" Even with everything that happened, Rebecca smiled, touching the sample collection tubes. "Of course, science doesn't stop, sweetheart. Neither does the search for truth." 6 months after James Parker's confession, the maple trees around Lake Champlain were blooming again. Spring had brought changes to Burlington, some subtle, others profound. The Parker house had been sold, with Rebecca and Sophie moving to a cozy cottage closer to the university, where Rebecca now headed the new Environmental Justice Research Center. The program specialized in developing detection methods for water-based crimes, inspired by the case that had shaken the quiet Vermont town. Sophie sat cross-legged on their new dock, her scientific journal open beside her. But this morning she wasn't recording lake observations. Instead, she was writing a letter that would be read at her father's sentencing hearing tomorrow. "Dear Judge Martinez," she wrote carefully, "you asked me to tell you how my father's actions affected my life. The truth is, they changed everything, but not in the way he expected." A familiar voice called out behind her. "Ready to go, science girl?" Sophie turned to see Emma walking down the dock, her first real smile in months lighting up her face. After returning from Seattle, Emma had struggled with the truth about her mother's death. But somehow, through their shared experience of loss and discovery, the girls' friendship had grown stronger. "Almost done," Sophie replied, adding a final line to her letter. "My father taught me that lies can sound like truth, but evidence and courage can expose them." The girls headed up to the cottage where Rebecca and Patricia Wells were preparing breakfast. The kitchen counter was covered with newspaper clippings. "Parker Financial Empire Crumbles. Justice for Lake Champlain Victims. Young Witness Inspires New Child Protection Laws." Sophie tried to avoid reading them these days, focusing instead on moving forward. "The DA called," Patricia announced as the girls sat down. "James's associates are all taking plea deals. The whole network is coming down." She smiled at Sophie. "Your testimony started a domino effect. 23 potential victims identified so far, all saved because you spoke up." Sophie pushed her eggs around her plate. "Will I have to testify again?" "No, sweetheart," Rebecca assured her. "Your work is done. The evidence you helped uncover, combined with your father's confession and the cooperating witnesses, is more than enough." Detective Chen arrived as they were finishing breakfast. She'd become a regular visitor, her initial protection duty evolving into genuine friendship. "Big day today," she said, helping clear the plates. "The university ceremony starts at noon." Sophie nodded, butterflies dancing in her stomach. The University of Vermont was honoring her mother's research team for their groundbreaking work in forensic limnology, the study of crime evidence in lakes and rivers. Sophie had been asked to speak about the importance of young people in science and justice. As they drove to the university, Sophie saw the changes her father's case had brought to Burlington. The investment firm's imposing building now housed a victim advocacy center. The lake's testing stations had been upgraded with new monitoring equipment. Even the courthouse had changed, adding a special interview room designed to help children feel safe telling difficult truths. The university auditorium was packed. Sophie recognized faces in the crowd. Mrs. Henderson, who had finally found the courage to share everything she'd witnessed. Mr. Harrison, who had turned state's evidence about the bank's involvement. And dozens of families whose lives had been saved by the unraveling of James Parker's schemes. When it was her turn to speak, Sophie brought her journal to the podium, not as evidence this time, but as a symbol of how truth could be preserved and protected. 6 months ago, she began, I was just a kid who loved science and trusted her dad. When that trust was broken, I could have stayed quiet. But my mom taught me that science is about observing, documenting, and standing up for the truth, no matter how hard it might be. She looked at Emma in the front row, then at her mother who was beaming with pride. What happened on Lake Champlain wasn't just about one crime or one person. It was about choosing between staying silent and speaking up, between accepting lies and demanding truth. I chose to speak up, to trust in evidence, to believe that even a kid's voice matters when she's telling the truth. After the ceremony, they gathered by the lake. The water sparkled under the spring sun, its surface peaceful now, its depths no longer hiding dark secrets. Sophie and Emma set up their research equipment. They'd started their own citizen science project, monitoring lake health and teaching other kids about environmental protection. "Look," Emma pointed excitedly. "The loons are back." Sophie smiled, reaching for her journal. Her new one filled not with evidence of crimes but with observations of life returning to normal. She recorded the date, time, and details of the loon's appearance, just as she'd done that morning so long ago when everything had changed. Detective Chen watched the girls work. "You know," she said to Rebecca, "the FBI is using Sophie's case to train agents about child witnesses. Her journal entries are becoming a model for how young people can document and report suspicious activities." Rebecca nodded proudly. "She's teaching a workshop next month at the middle school about scientific observation and civic responsibility. Turns out a lot of kids want to learn how to be citizen scientists." As the sun began to set, Sophie added one final note to her journal entry. "The truth is like the lake. Sometimes it seems dark and deep and scary. But if you're brave enough to look closely, to gather evidence, to stand up for what's right, it becomes clear as morning light on water." Emma joined her at the edge of the dock. "Ready for our evening samples?" Sophie looked at their reflection in the calm water. Two young scientists continuing the work that had helped bring justice to their quiet lakeside town. "Ready," she replied, knowing that while the dark chapters of their story had ended, the work of protecting truth and justice was just beginning. The lake stretched before them, its waters now a symbol not of secrets and loss, but of hope and renewal. Tomorrow would bring James Parker's sentencing, more media coverage, more reminders of the past. But here by the water, with her best friend beside her, her mother and their friends nearby, and her journal in her hands, Sophie felt only peace. She had found her voice, protected her mother, honored Emma's mom, and shown the world that even the smallest observer could make the biggest difference. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.